Hey, welcome to another episode of the Deeper the Know podcast. I'm super excited that I have Paul Austin here. I've been following on social media, resharing some of your posts because it's all around psychedelics. And welcome to the show. I'm super
Th-
excited to have you.
Thanks, Bennett. I'm glad to be here. Can't wait to dive in for today.
Paul, could we start with just a few minutes of your background? 2, 3 minutes of who you are and how'd you get to where you're at?
So, my story as it relates to psychedelics starts when I was 16. I grew up in a traditional family in West Michigan, quite religious, church every Sunday, very sheltered. Alcohol, drugs, these things were really looked down upon. And at the age of 16, I started to explore cannabis with a couple of close friends. And soon after, my parents found out. And my dad sat me down one Sunday after church. And my dad's a very kind man, but he was clearly impacted by the fact that I smoked some weed and looked at me and said, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 30 years ago. That's how big of a deal it was for my
Yeah.
parents at that point in time for their one son. I have a couple sisters, but for their one son to all of a sudden be, doing illegal drugs. And my experience of smoking cannabis was very fun, very interesting, and it was very different than what my parents were communicating to me about what it should be like or what they heard that it was like because they'd never smoked weed themselves.
Yeah.
Right? There's no way. And what I learned from that experience is if I really wanted to continue exploring this path and understanding these substances, I'd have to keep a certain aspect of who I am hidden from those who are closest to me. And so at the age of 19, I started to explore LSD and psilocybin mushrooms at higher doses and had really breakthrough and transformative experiences. And those experiences, one of the clear messages was conventionality is equivalent to mediocrity. And that if I wanted to live a life that was very purposeful and meaningful, that I would have to chart my own path. And so in my early 20s, I moved to Turkey where I taught English. I ended up living abroad for several years. And while living abroad in Budapest, once again was doing LSD at higher doses with a couple friends. And we were talking about the future of psychedelics at that point in time and that we thought, oh, psychedelics and microdosing in particular are only going to continue to grow in popularity, not only for their medical and therapeutic use, but also for performance, leadership, productivity, flow states, creativity, well-being, these more elevated states, which is what I've always been interested in. And so in 2015, I started Third Wave as an educational platform to inform the broader populace about intentional and responsible psychedelic use. And I just started to really put myself out there as an educator, and naturally, of course, also started to communicate the benefits of these substances to my parents,
Uh-huh.
and they were very skeptical initially, but we have a very loving relationship, and so even though they were skeptical, there was still some degree of openness. And so when Michael Pollan published his book How to Change Your Mind in 2018, I shared that book with my dad. He read it. He started to microdose. And then in 2019, I actually guided him through a high dose psilocybin experience, which was
Awesome.
incredible for him and for me as well. And so that really brought it full circle where when I was 16, I had to hide this part of myself. Through psychedelics, I learned to accept and love all parts of myself. And then I had, the privilege, I would say, and the honor of stewarding many millions of people into responsible and educational psychedelic use. But I would say even more importantly, helping my family to recognize and realize the power of these substances. And it's been really beautiful to see, in the past 10 years as I've done all this work, how impactful it's been for the many millions of lives that we've touched through our work at Third Wave.
It's awesome. What religion were you raised in?
Protestant, the Reformed Church of America, so
Okay.
Christianity, not fundamentalist, I would say, even progressive somewhat for being a Christian church. But the environment I was raised in with my parents in particular was very sheltered, and it was required. Church was obligatory. There was no getting out of it ever, any
Yeah.
time, even in the summer. Some people would go out to the lake houses. We were always there. So it
Church on
was
Sundays.
Yeah, it was impactful, and but also not my cup of tea. I'm not a church guy. I'm not a groupthink guy. I'm not a guy who goes along with sort of the grain and with what everyone else is doing. And I will say, as I started to get deeper into my psychedelic work, I became an atheist, at some point when I was 17, 18, 19. And then as I started to do psychedelic work, I came to realize some of the truths that were communicated through that religious upbringing, even if I didn't agree with a lot of the dogma that was inherent with it.
I relate to that a lot. I was raised in the Mormon. I mean, I'm in Utah, right?
Yeah.
But like 2 year mission, living in Mexico, getting married, and doing all, doing the whole thing. And I imagine for you, it is very. I looked at it. I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense at all. Now what do I do though? And then like rebuilding that, I feel like the first year is pretty scary. I'm like, I don't know what I believe in. And then fast forward a few years, I still don't know what I believe in, but it's okay. Well, before I was worried about it, I was like, I had the one and only true church. I had it all figured out. Like I wasn't perfect, but my church was perfect. As long as I did what the church said, then, I get the eternal reward. Um, how do you look on it now, I guess, like, and that was one of the questions I wrote down right at the beginning, like the good and the bad, because I feel like it shaped my entire life, even though I'm not associated with it. There was so much good that came from it. But anyways, I like to, you briefly touched on that. What are those truths that were, I guess, resonated with you more when you started doing psychedelics?
Well, it's interesting. A friend of mine, about a year ago, we were having dinner, and she was talking about how some of her community had started to get into 5-MeO DMT, which is a very, very intense psychedelic. It's a toad venom that you could smoke that brings you into white light unity bliss. And she said she noticed a pattern or a trend with those who had no religious upbringing. It destabilized them way more than people
Okay.
who had some sort of religious context. So I think a lot of it is the language, the rituals, the traditions, even the ceremonies. And so when we have especially a high dose psychedelic experience, so many of us have this experience of oneness, a connection to something greater than ourselves. There's a faith that's opened back up. And so when you grow up in the church, faith is central, right? Love is talked about, right? In fact,
Yeah.
part of the sort of story of the Christian church is that Jesus's love was the thing that redeemed us, right? That provided salvation. And so what I came to realize through my own psychedelic experiences is so much of modern religion has still does the rituals, they have the rhythms, but it's not a vital lived experience. In other words, the vast majority of people who consider themselves religious never have a really true awakening where they realize the divinity within themselves and they have that experience. And so I think the sort of negative aspects of mainstream religion or dogma that it doesn't create a real container to facilitate deep mystical lived experiences of transcendence. And so
Yeah.
what I came to, what I came to realize is Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, many other prophets throughout the years, they really had reached this state of enlightenment. And
Um,
for that reason, they were seen as incredible teachers and healers. And in my psychedelic work, I came to realize all of us have that innate capacity to be teachers and healers to reach those highly developed states. It requires years of work at times, it requires dedication and devotion, but it is possible. And I think that possibility allowed me to see that I didn't have to give up my power to something or someone outside of myself, that I could actually keep that contained to deepen my own spiritual practice and my own, growth and development as a human and, living in this crazy thing we call life and planet Earth.
yeah. I like how you said most religious people don't have that deepening, like that awakening. And I'm like, well, why is that? Because I definitely didn't have that. Even literally dedicating 2 years of my time, every hour of the day was structured, and I was completely obedient because obedience was everything.
Right.
And looking back at that, like, well, I never had the opportunity to question what was real or not because I was born into the one and only true church. Why go look for something? So like, I was like, I already have it, and I didn't know what I was missing out. Do you feel like that is part of the reason? Do you view it as, or is there something else as well that, religious people don't ever get the chance to have that spiritual awakening?
Well, so bit of history I think can be helpful here. So the name of the company, the name of the platform is the third wave of psychedelics, right? And the first wave being the ancient and also indigenous use, the second wave being the counterculture in the 50s and 60s, and the third wave of psychedelics being now. In the first wave of psychedelics, the ancient Greeks participated in a ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries. Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, Pythagoras, uh, all of the major philosophers, thinkers of that era participated in these mysteries, and they drank a beverage called koukion, which is made from ergot, the same thing that LSD is made from. So, in other words, they were drinking a psychedelic beverage. And this experience allowed them to connect with divinity. In fact, they had a phrase that was inscripted in the temple of where they hosted these mysteries. And that phrase was to die before you die, so you don't die when you die. So I'll say that again. To die before you die, so you don't die when you die. So in other words, the psychedelic experience facilitated this death and rebirth for them, right? When we're mainstream religion in the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. At that point in time, they shut down all of the Eleusinian mysteries because in order for religion to scale and reach tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, there has to be hierarchy involved, right? There has to be a priestly caste. The priestly caste are the ones that have the connection to God. Everyone else has to go through them. That we could say the plebs, if you will, don't have that capacity. Because if everyone was having awakenings, there would be a lot of chaos. There would be a lot of interpretation. So mainstream religion requires a certain level of dogma in order for the structure to maintain coherence. So, and even there's some people who say before the Christian church eliminated these Eleusinian mysteries, they actually had psychedelics in the very wine that they participated in or participated with in communion. So the wine that was in communion had a psychedelic effect. So I don't know if this is relevant in the Mormon church or not, but when I was raised in the church, every month we would have communion. We'd eat the little wafer. We would drink. In our church, it was grape juice, but in the Catholic church, they drank wine. And you're eating the body of Christ and you're drinking the blood of Christ, right? And so they actually, back in the day, you were literally drinking the blood of Christ because you were taking in that divine way of being. Today, there's none of that. Right, it's grape juice and wafers, and so
water and bread, and you do it every Sunday. That's what I
exactly
do.
right. And so there's no container to have these deep, profound, mystical awakenings in mainstream religion because it would just be way too chaotic. You'd have way too many people questioning
Yeah,
dogma, questioning the commandments, questioning the teachings, and that's very difficult to create coherence around. But it's necessary for enlightenment, right? And so we look at people like Jesus and the prophet Muhammad and Buddha and all of these other prophets. All of them were mystics. None of them fit within any sort of normal context. And so what I'm really interested in the present moment is how can psychedelics help a lot of people wake up to that inner divinity. I have a metaphor I use, the lotus flower metaphor. So the lotus flower represents enlightenment in Buddhism. And so I often talk about how we first need to till the soil, heal the trauma. We then need to plant the new seed of self through that ego death that happens with mushrooms. We need to water it and give it sunlight for integration so that new seed of self can grow. And then medicines like ayahuasca, San Pedro, even 5 help that lotus flower to fully blossom. And I think one of the greatest tasks that we face as a culture is how do we start to turn these altered states into altered traits. And so as more and more people leave the Mormon church, as more and more people leave, mainstream religion, a lot of people are still asking these deep questions. And I think psychedelics can help provide that inner personal truth of knowing, like I too have a spark of divinity within me. And for that reason, I'm going to cultivate that fire because it's so essential to my overall well-being.
yeah, I love that. For me, it's getting that I guess that connection, or like the deeper what I know, for me, it's more led to I don't know much, and I don't think anybody knows anything, but that's okay. You know, like
Right.
it's a mystery. You got to make life where you're gonna make it. Because again, back to the religion, Christ. When I told people I wasn't a member of the church, and then it was like, but you believe in God, right? But at least you believe in Christ, right? And I'm like, at first I'm like, I think, and then I like analyzed it from a different lens, and I think psychedelics help you do that by deactivating your brain and changing the way that it's able to process information, and you get to view the same thing from different points of view. And I'm like, wait, I have 3 kids. Do I want to teach my kids that they're born imperfect, and unless they do something that this person lived 2,000 years ago, like they without somebody else, they're incomplete. And I'm like, I don't want to teach that. I think love one another, the golden rule. There's so many good things, but I don't want to teach my kids or believe myself that I'm dependent on somebody else and their rules and commandments in order to reach whatever they want me to reach. So that was a little, and then once you explain it like that, I do think people are like, oh, I've never thought of that. I'm like, I also never thought about it until I experience these altered states of consciousness. But I
Right.
want to touch on the obedience, or the structure, because I've thought about that as well. It's like, okay, well, why are psychedelics legal in the 50s and 60s? Well, you don't want a bunch of people thinking for themselves. Like
Right.
me, I have a maybe 200 employees. I don't want them. I mean, I do, but like, it's easier if they just follow the system. If I have, when I had 10 employees, I can meet with them all one on one. I need to go on a break. Here's some PTO. Like, you just do it a case by case scenario. But once you grow, and this is small, right? 200 employees, I'm not going to talk to them and approve PTO. It's just set guidelines, because you kind of have to make the rules to the weakest link. That's why jaywalking is illegal, or you have the speed limits. How do you introduce this, psychedelics to society while recognizing that there's people on different wavelengths, and you have to, like, where's the structure at? It's either no structure or all structure is kind of how, in my mind, because yeah, I don't know how to draw the line. So I'd love
Yeah,
if
I'll
your
provide
feedback.
a good way to think about this, because this is what I reflect on a lot. Like, does everyone need to be doing a bunch of psychedelics and dissolving their ego and going through a death and rebirth process? Probably not. There was a really well-known philosopher, Terence McKenna, who I'm sure you've heard about or listened to some of his books. He wrote a book called Food of the Gods, True Hallucinations. He was the first one to talk about the Stoned Ape Theory, which was essentially that psilocybin mushrooms helped us to evolve our consciousness in order to speak and have religion and all these sorts of things. And what Terence McKenna said at a talk that he gave at Esalen in the 1980s was that it's not that everyone needs to be doing high doses of psychedelics and experiencing ego death. It's that 5 to 10% of people need to be hardcore psychonauts. They need
Okay.
to really commit and devote themselves to exploring the inner antipodes of their consciousness, to understanding the language and how to navigate that. And that these 5 to 10% of people then would be responsible for creating and developing the new systems in which everyone else would live. And so that's why I've focused on microdosing so much as this bridge for greater cultural accessibility in the third wave of psychedelics, because when you take a low dose of a psychedelic, a microdose, just 2 or 3 times a week for a month or 2 months or 3 months, people notice they have a better mood, they have more energy, they sleep better, they learn quicker, they're more present, they have healthier relationships. And so it helps with tangible and productive aspects of everyday living. And so my hypothesis is that there are folks like you and me and other entrepreneurs and creatives and leaders and risk takers who, for sure, let's go and explore the deep reaches of consciousness, and let's take those lessons back and weave them into the organizations and the art and the other systems that we want to see created in the world. But the vast majority of people would just benefit from getting off Prozac and getting on a microdosing protocol, or getting off Ritalin and getting on a microdosing protocol, or they'd benefit from, getting a little bit of better sleep or having a better mood or better energy. So when I look at microdosing, I think that is the bridge, right? That there is a physiological benefit. There's no spiritual stuff. There's no mystical stuff. It's not like you're seeing God when you take a microdose. But if you do it 2 or 3 times a week, people notice I'm more present, I'm less reactive, I'm sleeping better, I'm more
Yeah.
patient. And I think
Well,
that as a tool is the way to get a lot of folks working with psychedelics without worrying about totally destabilizing all of the systems. Because what happened in the 60s, it wasn't that LSD was bad per se. It's that everyone was just doing way too much LSD. You know, if everyone had just been microdosing and taking a little bit, we'd be living in a totally different world than we currently live in. These wouldn't have been prohibited necessarily. And so I think emphasizing these low doses, ideally in combination with meditation, breath work, yoga, movement, sauna, cold plunge, relationship, therapy, coaching, whatever it is, whatever modality you want to combine, that low dose work combined with other modalities, that I think is where the real potent possibility lies for cultural, individual transformation, but also cultural transformation.
Here's the issue with that. You could grow mushrooms anywhere and you could buy it off of Amazon and it's cheap. And then you can get off of all of I shouldn't say all, but there's a high probability that you get off of these other medications. And where's the money in that, you know? Where's the money in everybody growing their own mushrooms to be happy? No, but I totally agree with you. And it's funny, on Amazon, you know, you can go buy the spores because it's legal to buy the spores, but illegal to grow it. And then it says all of the suggestions of what else you should buy. And it's like the whole packet to grow mushrooms. Right. All right. Amazon's on board.
We actually, on Third Wave, we sell a mushroom grow kit as well. We have a microdosing, you know, experience. We also have a training program for practitioners. And I think the deeper point that you're getting at is psychedelics facilitate autonomy. They facilitate sovereignty. They facilitate the willingness to go, it's similar to the religion kind of context that we were just talking about. I'm not going to give up my power to this doctor or this psychiatrist or this pharmaceutical company. I don't want to be dependent and addicted to these psychiatric medications for the rest of my life. I want to take the power back into my own hands, and psychedelics are helping a lot of people to do that. And so my hope would be that in the next 10 to 15 years, psychedelics make a massive dent in the pharmaceutical monopoly for mental health and bankrupt a lot of these major pharmaceutical companies, because I truly believe that the future is decentralized. I believe the future is mycelial. I believe there will be a natural attraction or alignment to technologies that help us to decentralize. And I think mushrooms are the medicine of the people, and they're going to help a lot with helping us get off pharmaceuticals, actually taking back control of our life and asking ourselves, what do I want? Not what does my government want, or what do these pharmaceutical corporations want, or not even what does my family or my parents want, but what do I want to create, and how can psychedelics help inspire me to go do that?
Yeah, I think that is, let's talk about risks of psychedelics, because I'm a big promoter of it. And probably the number one thing, you kind of like, okay, well, you can't overdose on psilocybin, like it's non-toxic. You could drink anything, lemonade, right? And you're going to be gone before me, because sugar's worse for you. And it's like, oh, really? I didn't know that. And I didn't know that either until it was introduced to me. And then it usually gets brought up like, I don't need psychedelics. My response is, nobody needs psychedelics. You don't need a cell phone. You don't need a car, but it's a tool. And out of any tool, risk-reward ratio, I don't know of another tool in the world that's better. Like, the reward is potentially changing your entire life for the better, and the risk, and that's where I'm going to ask you, typically the risk outside of maybe psychosis, and I don't know what the probability and odds are that, and obviously we're not giving recommendations to anybody on the podcast, but it's a few hours of hell, you know, and I've gone through that. My mushroom experiences are usually terrible. Like 30 minutes to an hour and a half of just like anxiety, despair, depression sometimes, and then you come out of it and you're just like, holy crap, nothing even matters anyway, and love and abundance and all of that. I guess what we'll do,
like CrossFit. It's like CrossFit for the soul. That's how I frame it. Like, intense workouts also suck, and we do intense workouts because there's a hormetic response there, right? It sucks in the short term, but it's beneficial in the long term. And psychedelic experiences can sometimes be that way as well.
And this will be completely anecdotal, but how many people do you feel like you've known that are doing psychedelics, and how many of those people are having permanent negative reactions, such as something as extreme as psychosis? Like, where's that line of worry, and how should we be careful around that?
It's a great question. So there's about 1% of people who have a predisposition to psychosis or schizophrenia. who either have a family history of it or maybe who had an experience when they were younger. So anyone who has a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia or has had some sort of experience like that at a younger age should not touch psychedelics, should not even touch microdoses of psychedelics. The veil is too thin already. And like I said, it's about 1% of people who have that. Overall, what I've noticed is about 60 to 70% of people have really profound and life-changing experiences with psychedelics. Probably about another 20% of folks, 20 to 25% of folks have a pretty good experience, but it's not anything that's like overly profound, not harmful or negative, but not necessarily overly beneficial. And then I would say 5 to 10% of people can have very challenging experience. It doesn't mean they're traumatized necessarily. Oftentimes it's because they jumped in the deep end too quick. They destabilized themselves too much. They totally blew up their entire scaffolding, the ego scaffolding, and they're destabilized, and they don't have the professional support in order to restabilize. We see this most commonly with ayahuasca and 5-MeO-DMT, the one that I mentioned earlier, which is a toad venom that you can smoke. So almost all of the risk of psychedelic work, almost all of it, not all of it. Like I said, there's about 1% of people who, if you have a predisposition to psychosis, schizophrenia, should not touch it. But almost everyone else can benefit from this work if it's done in a skillful way. And by skillful, I mean you have a coach or practitioner who's helping to support you. That coach or practitioner understands the different medicines and where to start you at. You start low and go slow. You don't necessarily jump in the deep end right away. Maybe you start with microdosing. You do medi-dosing, which is like you're not having a full journey, but you're noticing some changes in your overall state. And then after you've done that work, potentially you're opening the door to much deeper, more profound work. But I think the fixation on, I want to see God, I want to have a mystical experience, that is one of the most harmful aspects of the hype and resurgence of interest around psychedelics. People hear about this mystical experience and they're like, I want that.
Yeah.
But they don't realize that it's both heaven and hell. You know, this is what Aldous Huxley wrote about in The Doors of Perception in the 1950s when he did mescaline. He says, you can access the most blissful and joyful states that you will ever experience with a psychedelic. And equally so, you know, living in the dual world, the world of duality that we live in, you can also experience the most terrifying and nightmarish states. And so the courage, sometimes, like you mentioned, some of your experiences are still challenging. For me as well, every now and then I'll have a very challenging experience. I look that as an opportunity to confront aspects of myself, what we call the shadow, emotions, stories, narratives that I wouldn't normally face. And that's not always easy, especially for people, you know, individuals who have, you know, maybe they've had a lot of trauma. They've been sexually assaulted. There's been, you know, they've had an alcoholic parent. They've been neglected, right? Oftentimes, high-dose psychedelic work puts you face to face. You have to confront the trauma. You have to confront these deep, dark aspects of yourself. It's the only way to heal it, is by bringing it into the light and bringing it into awareness. And that's not for the faint of heart. That can be very, very challenging to navigate.
I've definitely, I mean, just off the top of my head, but the top 5 worst experiences in my life and top 5 best experiences, both psychedelics. And I think this is maybe from the Netflix documentary based on that book, The How to Change Your Mind. I believe it was 85% of people that try psilocybin will rate it as the top 5 experiences of their life. And I'm like,
Correct.
What? Again, risk versus reward ratio. And then to hear like, I don't need it, but yet I drove here in my car. Well, you don't need a car. You could have walked. It's a tool. Like,
It's a
why aren't we using
technology,
the best
right?
tool?
Yeah, the metaphor that I use is we all want to experience more joy, more presence, better relationships, more energy, a better mood. We all, as humans, have that drive. When we do a psychedelic, the clouds part from the mountaintop. We can actually see this higher self that we're meant to become, and it creates an imprint. And now you can sit down, you can meditate for hours a day for years, or do breath work or yoga, and it'll take you a long time to get there. Or within a safe container, you can take a high dose of a psychedelic, and within about an hour, you can experience this state of enlightenment. And there's so many incredible lessons and learnings from it. And like you said, it's like if I want to get from point A to point B, you can walk, but if that walk is 100 miles, you're obviously going to prefer to drive unless there's, you're walking for cancer or something like that. So that framing, I think, is helpful and very important. It's a shortcut, just like a car is a shortcut. People often hear shortcut and they're skeptical. But I believe psychedelics are a technological shortcut to this state of bliss and enlightenment. It requires, just like a car requires brakes and, turn signals and certain, seat belts. It requires certain measures to keep you protected. You're not going to wear a seat belt when you're walking, anywhere. So there are certain things that need to be contained and held. But if those are honored and you have a great therapist or coach or practitioner, I think the vast majority of people will benefit or have benefit from psychedelics.
There's a podcast with Sam Harris and Andrew Huberman on consciousness and psychedelics, a good 4 hours, and it was freaking
Wow.
awesome. And Sam Harris said you put 100 people in a room and you tell them to meditate for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever the time was. 95 of them are going to come out of that experience being like, not going to do that again. Like, there's nothing interested. You put 100 people in the room, give them 2 grams of psilocybin. All 100 of them are like, okay, there's something more there. So like, yeah, it's kind of the shortcut, but that negative, I'm like, language is a shortcut. I could write to you. I could do sign language. Like, everything is a shortcut. Like, why are we
That's human
saying one thing is
ingenuity.
a
Right? It's
bad
human
shortcut than
ingenuity.
the other one? I
Exactly.
don't, and I do
Exactly.
think it's just, kind of society. But taking a step back into your personal life, I know we dove in deep on the psychedelic side. I want to hear more of your purpose and how that evolved. Maybe it was before 16, or like, when did you attach yourself to whatever your purpose is now? And I'd love to hear that. And how did that change and that transition take place?
So, in these early psychedelic experiences, for me, I had a deep, profound connection to nature because I was often doing LSD in nature with a friend or two. So, I had this deep, profound connection to the environment. And so, when I was 24 and starting Third Wave and just trying to figure out what do I want to really commit and devote myself to as a mission, as a purpose, I thought back to those psychedelic experiences, noticed that more research was coming out. I dove deep down the rabbit hole. Read like 20 books about psychedelics. And what I came out of that with is to address what I consider to be the greatest challenge of our time, which is the decimation of the environment, what I would call ecocide. Just a total disconnection to nature and everything that she represents. I think psychedelics are the quickest and most effective way to remember how deeply intertwined we are with our natural environment. And so, what my purpose is more than anything is how do we create a cultural container for safe and effective psychedelic use to accelerate our evolution as a human species so
Hmm.
we can not only survive, but I would argue so we can thrive in the face of what is a very uncertain landscape at this point in time. No one knows what life is going to be like 5 or 10 years from now. And I believe that psychedelics offer a glimpse into a wisdom path that can help us to navigate a lot of uncertainty in this time of unknown.
And I think with the emergence of AI and how many guardrails there should be that aren't, like, how do you determine those? What a good opportunity to leverage psychedelics. On the nature aspect, I think that's really cool. I've never been one to be connected with nature, and only recently, like, I will go outside just to feel better because it makes it like I could notice it now, where before I'm like, a hike, where are we going? How long is it going to take? And what do I get it? What do I get when I get there?
Yeah,
Nothing about
exactly.
enjoying the journey. It was just like, I'm just here to complete another goal, another checklist. A few months ago, I had a psychedelic experience with my family, my wife's family, which was really amazing. And I walked outside, and it's night, and I see a bajillion houses, and I'm like, damn it, I wish I was in nature. Like, I wish I was in nature. And then it occurred to me on that moment, I'm like, well, like, if a bird is nature and a bird's nest is nature, like, what's the difference between these houses being nature. Um, and I'm not challenging that we're not destroying the environment and all, but it did allow me to see it from a little. I'm like, no, humans are nature. And Alan Watts, if you ever heard of that, he says the earth peoples, like we are a product of the earth, and whatever we build is a product of the earth, same way as a beaver's dam, you know. Love to hear your thoughts on humans and that separation that we often do. Like there's nature and there's humans and we need to integrate it. I'm kind of like, we are already integrated. We're just bad at it. We're just rude to the earth. I don't know.
Well, I still think there's a sense of we believe nature is something to be plundered and extracted from rather than something to stay in a reciprocal relationship with. That's changing rapidly. In fact, I just read a statistic the other day where it's like 30% of energy now comes from renewable energy sources. But if you look at the lineage or the philosophy of industrialism, a lot of it is how do we, and this is even rooted in Christianity to a large degree, how do we take from the earth to make ourselves more powerful? And what indigenous people knew in the fabric of their being is that their well-being was intertwined directly with the well-being of the ecosystem that they lived within. So I think we're coming back into a more harmonious relationship with nature. I think when I even think of like a city like New York, for example, which I lived in for a couple years. There's Central Park and there's Prospect Park, but being in New York has it literally creates a physical stress on your autonomic nervous system, right? Because there's so much concrete and there's so much stress and noise and loudness. And so we're healing that relationship with nature. But I don't think that we're yet fully aligned with what I would call like a triple bottom line, which is from an organizational perspective and a business perspective. There's in traditional business, there's what's called externalities, which is, like companies that dump waste in a river don't have to pay for that, right? Or at least they didn't up until maybe the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years. Or DDT is a chemical which was invented in the 60s and dumped all over. We found out that it later caused birth defects and all these sorts of things. So I think there's still a way in which business is not fully responsible. We see this with oil companies in the Amazon, massive oil spills that kill an incredible amount of biodiversity, and they essentially do their best to just clean their hands of it and take no responsibility for the decimation that they've caused. So I do think there's still more work to be done when it comes to accountability and responsibility, especially for big corporate business in terms of how they take care of the environment. And I would say in 2024, we're at a better point than we have been in potentially hundreds of years. Like, I'm optimistic that we're going to figure out our way. I just think there's still some fuck ups that need to be addressed and held accounted for. Like I just come back to biodiversity. It's something like how many species are going extinct? 95% of species or something like that are going extinct. We haven't seen this since the last great extinction. And biodiversity is central to diversity breeds immunity. And so the more biodiversity we have, the more immune we are to, I think, existential risk as a human species.
I like that. But at the end, you are separating humans and human creation from nature. There's a line there. Is that correct? And then how do you kind of get back,
I think in
bring it back?
industrialism there has been. That's not true for all humans in all places, but industrialism has created this sense of separation, right? I am me, you are you. This is Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right? And I think what we're learning is how do we come back into a way that we are creating from a place of deep relationship with nature rather than wanting to take from her. I think a lot of the human creation has been taking, and there's been a lot of externalities that have decimated our ecosystem and biodiversity. It's just been totally out of balance. And so we're still figuring out how do we find that balance, but it's a great frame to set up. I think it's a helpful frame.
Yeah, and my personal opinion on that is as long as we have the right leaders, and I love how 5 to 10% of people, psychonauts, really guiding it. But man, the more I dive into AI and what I can ask it, and also the paperclip theory of you tell an AI system make as many paper clips as possible, and then it kills humans and computer desks to then make paper clips. It's like if we get that right, then we say don't make as many paper clips as possible, but there's just going to be so much more and more abundance that
For
we
sure.
don't need to be taking so much from the environment or anything. So I'm hoping
That's our
that
hope.
with AI,
Yeah.
yes, with that, it's going to make us thrive or kill us, one or the other. But
Well,
don't
and
remember,
this is also true in with cars. What Tesla's building now, driving cars is probably the most dangerous thing that we do. And
Mhm.
AI is helping us to make that substantially and significantly safer. People are skeptical, but I think at the end of the day, it'll be incredibly successful. And I think AI could have a similar effect where all these people are going to lose their jobs. Well, where does that time and energy go? Well, what we did in the 1930s during the Great Depression is, the I think it was the new plan that was passed, and all of these people just started planting trees everywhere and open national parks. So I think there's going to be, with AI and the loss of jobs, how do we redirect that energy to really reinvest in our ecosystems, taking care of them, replanting them, and ensuring that biodiversity continues to thrive and succeed?
Yeah. I mean, it's ultimately we're looking at as, there's only so many resources, and I have a task to do in my company. And in order to complete that task, I'm going to take resources from the environment. Or if we have other better resources, more efficient ways to completing something, I think that's a big key. Jumping, we're going to run it over, but I'm going to ask you one or two more questions, more focused again on your personal life. I like to focus in here, especially somebody that's heavy in the psychedelics. Like, what is a low point in your life or the lowest point? And I want to hear about that and what tools you use to get out of that. Because a lot of times, we get out of it, we look back, oh, we learned so much, there's so much good. But there's so many of us that are in the low point right now. What do you say to people that are in the low point right now as it relates to, I guess, your history of getting through mental health challenges? Okay. Paul, I appreciate the insights and everything that you've given us. Super, super cool. Love what you're doing. Everybody needs to definitely check out Third Wave. But tell us your personal social medias. How do people connect with you? Your website, all of that.
So thethirdwave.co is our platform. You could also just Google Third Wave microdosing. We have a practitioner training program, for any coaches or those who want to become coaches or practitioners in this space. That's through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And then if folks want to find me on social, I'm at Paul Austin 3W. Paul Austin 3W, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram. And if anyone has questions or has any follow-ups, please reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to help in any way that I can.
So, and we'll include all of those in the show notes. So, Paul, thanks for hopping on.
Thank you, Bennett.